At this level, you do not belong here, Dad. My daughter Olivia did not even raise her voice when she said it, but the microphone in her hand was still live, and her words carried clean and sharp across the entire ballroom, cutting through the soft violin music and the low murmur of 200 guests dressed in black tie and evening gowns. For a moment, no one moved. Then I felt it, that subtle shift in the air when attention turns into judgment. Heads turned. Conversations died mid-sentence. Glasses paused halfway to lips. Every eye in that $40,000 family reunion landed on me. I stood just inside the entrance, one step past the velvet rope, the polished marble floor reflecting the gold light of chandeliers above me, and suddenly the room that I had paid for felt like it belonged to someone else. Olivia lowered the microphone slowly, her expression composed, almost bored, as if she had just corrected a minor mistake instead of erasing me in front of everyone who mattered to her. Jason, her husband, stood beside her in a tailored navy tuxedo, one hand resting casually in his pocket, the other wrapped around a crystal glass of champagne. He did not say anything. He did not need to. The faint smile at the corner of his mouth said enough. A security guard in a black suit approached me from the side, polite but firm, his hand hovering near my arm without touching it yet, as if waiting for permission to remove a problem. I glanced past him toward the far end of the room where the long tables were arranged under cascading white flowers and soft candlelight. Name cards were set with perfect precision, each one printed in gold. I did not need to walk over to know mine was not there. Olivia had made sure of that. There must be some confusion, I said quietly, not to the guard, not even to Olivia, but to the moment itself, as if it might correct itself if I gave it time. Olivia met my eyes then, and there was no confusion in hers. Only distance. There is no confusion, she said, her voice lower now, but still audible in the silence she had created. This is a private event. Private. I let that word settle. The same house where she had taken her first steps. The same place where I had signed the papers 15 years ago, trusting that what I was building would outlive me. Around us, the guests began to shift again, whispers starting to ripple through the room like wind through leaves. I caught fragments. Is that her father? Why is he here? I thought this was invite only. I did not answer any of them. I simply stood there, taking in the details the way I always did when something did not add up. The floral arrangements were new. The lighting rig above the dance floor had been installed recently, and the event permit posted discreetly near the entrance carried a name I did not recognize. Something about that did not fit. But Olivia had already turned away from me, lifting her glass as if nothing had happened, as if I had already been erased. And in that moment, I realized she believed it. She believed I did not belong here. The guard's hand finally made contact with my sleeve, light but deliberate, the kind of touch that carried an expectation without needing force, and I turned my head just enough to look at him, not with anger, not even with resistance, but with the same measured attention I used when reviewing a contract line by line, because moments like this were rarely about what was being said out loud. They were about what had already been decided behind the scenes, and I could feel it in the way he avoided my eyes, in the way his posture remained respectful but firm, as if he had been instructed carefully on how to remove someone who did not look like trouble, but had to be treated as if he was. And somewhere behind him, I heard Jason's voice, low, amused, speaking to a group of guests who were pretending not to watch, but listening to every word. We had to keep things curated this time. You know how these events can get. And there it was, the word curated. As if I were clutter, as if I were something that needed to be edited out for the sake of appearance. And I let that settle in my chest without reacting, because reacting would have given them exactly what they expected, an old man embarrassed, emotional, out of place, confirming the narrative they had already built for the room, and I was not interested in playing that role, not tonight. So instead I adjusted my jacket slightly, the same gray one I had worn to Olivia's college graduation, and I stepped half an inch back from the rope on my own terms, just enough to release the guard from having to guide me. And he seemed almost relieved, like a man spared from an uncomfortable task. "Thank you, sir," he murmured quietly, and I nodded once, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement. Then I let my eyes drift again across the room, slower this time, taking inventory. Because something about this entire setup was wrong in a way that went beyond family dynamics. The catering staff moving with a precision that suggested an outside company. The lighting equipment branded with a vendor I had never approved for this property. The valet tickets being handed out at the entrance. And most of all, the way the guests spoke about the house as if it were a venue, not a home, not my home. And that was when a voice came from my left, low and careful. Sir, I do not mean to intrude, but this event was booked under a corporate account. I turned slightly to see a young waiter, maybe mid-20s, holding a tray of empty champagne flutes, his expression polite, but his eyes sharper than his uniform suggested. Corporate account. I repeated, just loud enough for him to hear, and he gave a small nod. Yes, sir, Reed Holdings, I believe. They handled everything through management. Reed, of course, Jason's name, his company, or at least the version of it he liked to present, and I felt something shift, not emotionally, but structurally. Like a piece of a puzzle sliding into place, because I knew exactly how this property was held. I knew every clause, every limitation, every condition tied to it, and leasing it out for a commercial event without proper authorization was not just a casual oversight. It was a violation, a clear one, the kind that triggered consequences automatically, the kind that did not require argument or confrontation, just documentation and timing. And for the first time since I had stepped through those doors, I felt something steady beneath my feet again. Not anger, not hurt, but clarity, cold and precise. I looked back toward Olivia, who was now laughing lightly with a group near the center of the room, her hand resting on Jason's arm, completely at ease, completely certain that the situation had been handled, that I had been handled, and I wondered, not for the first time, when that certainty had replaced the girl who used to run down these same halls calling my name. But that thought passed quickly, because sentiment was not useful here. Facts were, and the fact was simple. She believed this house was hers to use. Jason believed it was his to leverage, and both of them had just made a decision based on that belief, publicly, visibly, with witnesses, and that made everything cleaner. I slipped my hand into my coat pocket and felt the edge of my phone, the weight of it familiar, grounding. And for a moment, I just stood there at the threshold, between the noise of the event and the quiet certainty forming in my mind. Then I turned away from the ballroom, not hurried, not defeated, just deliberate. And as I walked toward the exit, I could still hear the music rising again behind me, the laughter returning, the illusion restoring itself. But I knew something they did not. Illusions built on the wrong foundation do not collapse loudly at first. They crack quietly, almost politely, and then they give way all at once. And as the cool night air met my face outside, I already knew exactly where the first crack had formed. I did not rush to my car. I did not fumble for keys or check my phone immediately like someone shaken. I simply walked down the stone path that curved away from the front entrance, past the valet stand where young men in pressed uniforms were exchanging ticket stubs and polite smiles, completely unaware that the ground beneath their polished shoes did not belong to the man who had hired them for the night. The air outside was cool, carrying that faint scent of trimmed hedges and expensive cologne drifting from the open doors behind me. And I paused just long enough to look back at the house, not with nostalgia, but with precision, the way an inspector studies a structure for stress points. Every window was lit. Every room was occupied. Music spilled out through the entrance in soft waves, the illusion of success, of belonging, of control. And all of it, every glass, every light fixture, every square foot of that property, existed under terms they clearly did not understand. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone, not hurried, not dramatic, just deliberate, and I scrolled to a name that had not changed in over 20 years. Callahan. He answered on the second ring. Mr. Whitmore, he said, his voice steady, professional, already alert. He did not ask why I was calling at this hour. He never did. I need you to pull the file on the Lakeview property, I said, my tone even, almost quiet against the background hum of distant traffic. There was a brief pause, not confusion, but recognition. The primary residence under the private trust? He asked. Yes, I replied. Confirm the usage clause regarding commercial activity. I could hear the faint tapping of keys on his end, the sound of someone accessing something that had been prepared long before this moment. Section 8B, he said after a few seconds. The property cannot be used for any commercial or corporate event without written authorization from the trustee. Violation triggers immediate review and potential suspension of occupancy rights. I let that sentence settle in the space between us. Suspension of occupancy rights. Not eviction. Not confrontation. Just a quiet, automatic shift in status. Has any authorization been filed? I asked. Another pause, shorter this time. No, sir. There is no record of approval for any such event. I looked back at the house again, at the valet stand, at the line of cars pulling up, at the guests stepping out in tailored suits and polished heels, laughing as if they had stepped into something permanent. Good, I said softly. Then I want you to initiate a formal review under 8B. Tonight. There was no hesitation on his end. Understood. Do you want full enforcement? That question mattered. It was not about legality. It was about timing. About how visible the consequences would be. I watched as a couple handed their keys to a valet. The man joking about how long the open bar would last, completely unaware that the event itself had already crossed a line it could not uncross. Yes, I said finally. Full enforcement. But do it by the book. Notify management, the leasing office, and the event coordinator. I want everything documented. And the occupants? Callahan asked carefully. I did not answer immediately. Instead, I let my eyes rest on the front doors, where Olivia stood for a moment, framed by light, laughing at something Jason had just said, her posture relaxed, her expression untouched by doubt. For a second, she looked exactly like the child she used to be, confident in a world she believed was secure. Then the moment passed. They will be informed when the process begins, I said. No sooner. Callahan understood. He always did. I will have the notices drafted and delivered within the hour, he said. You will receive copies for your records. Thank you, I replied, and I ended the call without another word. For a few seconds, I stood there with the phone still in my hand, the quiet of the night settling around me in contrast to the noise behind me, and I felt something shift fully into place. Not anger, not even satisfaction, just alignment. The kind that comes when facts replace assumptions. I slipped the phone back into my pocket and began walking toward the curb, where a black sedan waited under the soft glow of a street lamp, the driver already stepping out as he recognized me. Good evening, sir, he said, opening the rear door. I gave one last glance toward the house, not to see what I was leaving, but to confirm what I already knew. They believed they had removed me from the equation. They believed the night belonged to them. They were wrong, and they were about to find out in the most precise way possible. The door of the sedan closed with a soft, insulated thud that sealed me away from the noise of the house, and for a brief moment, there was only silence inside the car, the kind that allows thoughts to settle into clear lines instead of scattered reactions, and I leaned back slightly against the leather seat, watching through the tinted window as the scene behind me continued, as if nothing had shifted. Valet attendants still moving with rehearsed efficiency, guests still arriving with practiced confidence, laughter still spilling into the night air like it had every right to be there. And that was the thing about moments like this. The illusion never breaks immediately. It holds just long enough for everyone inside it to feel safe, to feel certain, and I had seen that pattern too many times to mistake it for stability. The driver eased the car forward without needing instruction, pulling away from the curb with a smoothness that matched the quiet control of the evening. And as we turned onto the main road, the house disappeared behind a row of tall hedges, its lights fading from view, but not from my mind, because I knew exactly what was happening inside. The music had likely returned to full volume, the tension diluted by alcohol and conversation, Olivia probably reassuring a few curious guests with a dismissive comment, something light, something controlled, something that framed me as an inconvenience rather than a factor, and Jason would be reinforcing that narrative with confidence. Because men like him rely on momentum. They believe that as long as the room keeps moving, the story stays theirs. But momentum has limits, especially when it is built on assumptions instead of structure. My phone vibrated once in my pocket, a single, controlled notification, and I did not check it immediately. I did not need to, because I already knew what it meant. Callahan worked with precision, not speed for the sake of appearance. And when he said within the hour, he meant the process had already begun before the call had ended. I let the vibration fade before I reached into my pocket and brought the phone into view, the screen lighting up with a message that was as concise as expected. Review initiated. Notices in progress. Management alerted. No extra words, no unnecessary detail, just confirmation that the first mechanism had engaged. I nodded slightly to myself and placed the phone back down on my lap, my gaze shifting out toward the passing streetlights that moved in steady intervals across the window, each one marking time in a way that felt almost deliberate, because timing was everything in situations like this, not speed, not force, but sequence. Inside the house, it would start small, a quiet interruption, a manager receiving a call, a coordinator being pulled aside, a question about permits, about authorization, about documentation that could not be produced because it had never been secured, and from there, the structure would begin to adjust, not collapse, not yet, but shift, just enough for the people inside to feel it without fully understanding it. I could almost see it, Jason's expression tightening for a fraction of a second as someone whispered in his ear, Olivia turning slightly, her smile holding but her eyes searching for context, the band pausing between songs longer than expected, a subtle break in rhythm that no one would comment on but everyone would notice. And that was how it always began, not with noise, but with questions. The driver glanced at me briefly through the rearview mirror. "Would you like me to take you to the residence, sir?" he asked, his tone respectful, neutral. And I considered the question for a moment, not because I needed time to decide, but because I understood what it represented. Returning there tonight would turn this into something else, something reactive, something visible too soon. And that was not how this needed to unfold. "No," I said calmly. "Take me to the office," he nodded once, adjusting the route without hesitation. And the car continued forward, leaving the neighborhood behind as the roads widened and the city lights grew brighter ahead. I rested my hand lightly against the armrest, feeling the steady motion of the vehicle, and allowed my thoughts to settle into their final alignment. Olivia had made a decision tonight, publicly, clearly, and without hesitation. She had drawn a line and placed me outside of it. Jason had supported that decision, amplified it, and anchored it in a structure he believed he controlled. And now, that structure was being tested against the reality it was built on, not through confrontation, not through argument, but through the one system. Neither of them had taken the time to understand. And as the city skyline came into view, reflected faintly in the glass, I realized something that felt less like a conclusion and more like a confirmation. They did not remove me from that house tonight. They removed themselves from the terms that allowed them to remain there, and that distinction would matter very soon. By the time we reached the office building, the city had settled into that late evening rhythm where everything moved a little quieter but with more intention, and I stepped out of the car without hesitation, the glass doors reflecting a version of me that looked exactly the same as it had an hour ago, but carried a completely different weight behind the eyes. The lobby was nearly empty. Just a single receptionist at the far desk and the low hum of climate control filling the space. And as I walked across the polished floor, I noticed the small details the way I always did. The security badge scanner blinking steadily, the digital clock above the elevators marking the time down to the second, 9:42 p.m., which meant the notices had already been delivered or were seconds away from it. And timing like that was not coincidence. It was design. I pressed the elevator button and waited, my hands still, my breathing even, because nothing about this required urgency anymore. The sequence had already been set in motion. When the elevator doors opened, I stepped inside and pressed the top floor, watching the numbers rise slowly, each one bringing me closer to the place where everything had originally been built, not just the company, but the structure that held everything else together, including the house, including Olivia's belief that it was hers. The doors opened onto a quiet hallway lined with glass offices, most of them dark, a few still lit where late work lingered, and at the end of the corridor, my office stood exactly as I had left it, unchanged, controlled, waiting. I entered without turning on the overhead lights, letting the soft glow from the city skyline through the windows illuminate the room instead, and I walked to the desk, placing my phone down carefully, not out of caution, but out of habit, everything in its place, everything intentional. The screen lit up again with a second message before I even sat down. This one longer, more detailed. Event coordinator notified. Property management initiated compliance review. Unauthorized use confirmed. Occupancy status under evaluation. I read it once, then again, not because I needed to understand it, but because I recognized the language, the exact phrasing that would now be moving through conversations inside that house. Words that sound neutral on paper, but carry consequences when spoken out loud. I could almost hear them. The coordinator pulling Jason aside, explaining that there had been a compliance issue, that documentation was required, that the property was not cleared for corporate use. Jason responding with confidence at first, then with irritation when the explanation did not bend. Olivia stepping in, trying to smooth it over, to reframe it, to regain control of a narrative that was starting to slip, and somewhere in that process, the realization beginning to form, small at first, almost dismissible, then sharper as more pieces failed to align. I moved around the desk and sat down, the leather chair adjusting beneath me with a familiar weight. And for a moment I allowed myself to look out at the city, the grid of lights stretching in every direction, each one representing a structure built on agreements, on contracts, on terms that most people never read but still live under. And that was the difference. Olivia and Jason had treated the house like an object, something to be used, displayed, leveraged, but it was never just an object. It was part of a system, a framework that had rules, and tonight they had stepped outside of those rules without realizing that the system did not argue. It did not negotiate in the moment. It simply responded. My phone vibrated again, this time not a message, but a call, and I already knew who it was before I looked at the screen. Olivia, her name appearing exactly where it always had, unchanged, as if nothing had shifted. I let it ring once, twice, 3 times, not out of hesitation, but because timing mattered even here. Then I answered, lifting the phone to my ear without speaking first. There was a brief pause on the other end, the kind that comes when someone is recalibrating their tone, and then her voice came through, controlled but strained at the edges. "Dad, what is going on?" she asked, and for a moment, I said nothing, not because I did not have an answer, but because I wanted her to hear the silence, to feel the space where certainty used to be. Before I responded, my voice calm, even, exactly as it had been all night. "You tell me, Olivia," I said, looking out over the city lights as I spoke. "You are the one hosting the event." There was a sharp inhale on the other end of the line, not loud, but controlled in a way that told me she was trying to hold something together that had already started to slip. And when Olivia spoke again, her voice had changed, still composed, but no longer certain. "They are saying there is some kind of compliance issue," she said, choosing her words carefully, as if language alone could stabilize the situation. "The event coordinator just pulled Jason aside, and now management is asking for documents we already provided." I leaned back slightly in my chair, letting her explanation unfold without interruption, because this was the moment where assumptions begin to collide with structure, and it always sounded the same at first, confusion framed as inconvenience. "What kind of documents?" I asked, not because I did not know, but because I wanted her to say it, to hear it in her own voice. There was a pause, longer this time, and I could hear the faint background noise behind her, the music lower now, voices closer together, no longer casual. "Authorization for commercial use," she said finally, the words coming out slower, less confident. "They are saying the property is not cleared for corporate events." I let a small silence follow that, just enough for the weight of it to settle. Then I spoke, my tone unchanged. "And is it?" Another pause, this one sharper. "Of course it is," she replied quickly, too quickly, the reflex of someone still holding on to a version of reality that had not yet been corrected. "Jason handled everything through his company." I nodded slightly, even though she could not see it, because that detail mattered, not for what it confirmed, but for what it revealed. "Through his company," I repeated, and I could almost feel her recalibrating again, trying to understand why I was not reacting the way she expected. "Yes," she said, a little more defensively now. "Reed Holdings, they booked the vendors, the staff, everything." I let that sit for a moment before I asked the only question that mattered. "And who authorized the use of the property?" This time, the silence stretched, not just a pause, but a gap, the kind that opens when a simple question does not have a simple answer. I could hear movement on her end, footsteps, a door closing somewhere. Her voice lowering as she stepped away from the room. "What are you implying?" she asked, and there it was, the shift from explanation to challenge, the moment where she sensed something underneath the surface but had not yet named it. I did not respond immediately. I gave her the space to sit with that question, then I answered, calm, precise. I am not implying anything. Olivia, I am asking who authorized it. Another pause, shorter now, more urgent. It is our house, she said, and this time there was no hesitation, just certainty, the same certainty she had carried when she stood in front of that microphone earlier. And for the first time in the conversation, I allowed a slight change in my tone, not louder, not sharper, just clearer. No, I said quietly. It is not. The silence that followed was immediate and absolute, the kind that erases background noise for a second, even through a phone line. I could almost feel her standing still, trying to process what she had just heard. What are you talking about? She asked. And now the control was gone. Not completely, but enough for it to show at the edges. I turned my chair slightly toward the window, looking out at the reflection of the city lights in the glass as I spoke. The property is held under a private trust, I said, each word measured, deliberate. It is not authorized for commercial use without approval from the trustee. There was a sharp exhale, then a quick response. Dad, that does not make any sense. We have lived there for years. We have hosted events before. I listened to her list those points as if repetition could override structure. Then I answered. You have lived there under occupancy terms, I said, and private gatherings are not the same as corporate events billed through a registered company. I could hear Jason's voice faintly in the background now, asking her something, his tone tighter than before, and Olivia lowered the phone slightly, responding to him in a quick whisper I could not fully make out. Then she came back on the line, her voice lower, more focused. They are saying the event has to be suspended until this is resolved, she said, and there was something new in her tone now, not just confusion, but pressure. Guests are asking questions. I closed my eyes for a brief second, not out of fatigue, but to mark the transition, the moment where the first visible crack had reached the surface. Then I opened them again and spoke, my voice steady, unchanged. Then you should answer them, I said, and this time, I did not leave space for interpretation, because this is the part where things stop being assumptions and start being facts. On the other end of the line, I heard it clearly this time, not just tension, but disruption, the kind that spreads unevenly through a room before anyone fully understands it. Voices overlapping, footsteps moving faster than before, the music cutting off mid-transition instead of fading naturally, and Olivia did not speak immediately, which told me more than anything she could have said, because silence from her had always meant she was recalculating, trying to regain control of something that had already moved beyond her reach. Dad, she said finally, and her voice was lower now, tighter, stripped of the confidence she had carried earlier in the evening. They are asking us to pause the event. I did not respond right away. I let her continue, because people reveal more when they are not interrupted. The property manager is here, she added, and there was a subtle emphasis on the word here, as if the physical presence of authority had made the situation real in a way that a phone call could not. He is saying there is a violation of the trust terms. I leaned forward slightly, resting my forearm on the desk, my fingers still, my posture unchanged, because nothing about this required adjustment from me. The sequence was unfolding exactly as it should. And is he correct? I asked, my tone steady. Not confrontational, not sympathetic, just factual. There was a brief sound of movement on her end, like she had turned away from someone speaking to her. Then she answered, slower this time. They are saying the event cannot continue without authorization. I nodded once, even though she could not see it. That is not what I asked, I said quietly, and the distinction landed immediately. I could feel it in the way she paused again, longer this time, the kind of pause that comes when the answer is already known but not yet accepted. Dad, she said, and there was something different in her voice now, something closer to frustration than control. This is not the time for technicalities. There are people here, important people, investors, clients. We cannot just shut this down over paperwork. I let that statement sit for a moment, not because it changed anything, but because it revealed exactly where she was standing. Still inside the assumption that importance could override structure. It is not paperwork, I replied, my voice calm, measured. It is the agreement that allows you to be there in the first place. There was a sharp exhale on her end, followed by a brief muffled exchange with Jason, his voice more audible now, less controlled. asking questions that did not have immediate answers, and when she came back on the line, the shift was unmistakable. "Jason is talking to them," she said, and there was an edge to it now, not quite panic, but no longer contained. "He is trying to sort it out." I glanced down at my desk, at the phone resting near my hand, at the message still open on the screen, the confirmation of a process that did not respond to negotiation. "He can try," I said, and I kept my tone neutral, not dismissive, just accurate. "But this is not something that gets sorted out in conversation." Another pause, shorter, more urgent. "Then what is it?" she asked. And this time the question was direct, stripped of framing, stripped of assumption. And for a moment, I said nothing, not because I did not have an answer, but because I wanted her to feel the space before it, the absence of control she had not experienced before. Then I spoke, my voice steady, precise. "It is a condition," I said, one that was clearly defined long before tonight. I could hear movement intensifying behind her now, chairs shifting, voices rising slightly, the subtle signs of an event losing its cohesion. "They are telling guests to step outside for a moment," she said quickly, almost as if saying it out loud might slow it down. "Just until this is clarified." I closed my eyes briefly, not out of emotion, but to mark the point where the internal shift had become external, the moment where what was happening could no longer be contained within explanations. Then I opened them again and looked out at the city, the lights steady, unchanged. "It is already clear," I said, my voice even, without emphasis. "They are just making it visible now." There was no immediate response this time, just silence. But it was not the same silence as before. It was heavier, filled with realization that had not yet fully formed into words, and I let it remain there, because this was the part that could not be rushed, the moment where belief gives way to fact, not through argument, but through consequence. And somewhere in the distance, through the faint noise still coming from her end of the line, I heard the sound of doors opening, of movement shifting outward, and I knew without needing to see it that the room she had controlled an hour ago was no longer hers to manage. For several seconds, neither of us spoke, but the silence was no longer empty. It was filled with movement on her side, the kind of controlled chaos that happens when a carefully staged environment begins to lose its structure piece by piece. And I could hear it clearly now, the muffled instructions, the polite but firm tone of staff guiding guests toward the exits. The subtle rise in voices that tried to stay composed but could not fully hide confusion, and somewhere in the background, Jason's voice cut through again, sharper this time, no longer confident, asking for a manager, demanding clarification, repeating phrases like, "This must be a mistake," and "We have authorization." But the problem with statements like that is they only work when the system agrees, and this one did not. "Dad," Olivia said again. And this time there was no attempt to control the tone, no effort to maintain the version of herself she had presented earlier in the night. "They are actually shutting it down." I did not answer immediately, because this was the point where acknowledgement was more powerful than reaction, and she continued before I could speak. "Guests are leaving," she added, and I could hear it now, clearly, the shift of doors opening repeatedly, the soft echo of footsteps on polished floors, the low murmur of conversations moving outward, no longer contained within the walls that had defined the event just an hour ago. "They are asking everyone to step outside until the situation is resolved," she said, and her voice caught slightly on the last word, not enough to break, but enough to reveal the strain underneath. I leaned back in my chair again, my eyes moving across the city lights beyond the glass, steady, unaffected, because this part was not about escalation, it was about exposure. "And what are you telling them?" I asked, my tone unchanged, and there was a brief pause before she answered. "I am telling them there is a technical issue," she said quickly, almost defensively, "that it will be resolved shortly." I let that sit for a moment. Then I spoke, not to correct her, but to place the reality where it belonged. "It will not," I said quietly, and the words landed exactly as they needed to. There was no immediate response, just a sharp intake of breath, and then her voice returned, lower, more urgent. "You knew this would happen," she said, not as a question, but as a realization, and I did not deny it. "I knew what would happen if the terms were violated," I replied, keeping the focus exactly where it belonged, on the structure, not on intention. "This is not about me knowing. Olivia, it is about you not asking. There was movement again on her end, closer now, more direct. As if she had stepped into a quieter space but could not escape the situation unfolding just beyond the door. Jason is saying we can fix this, she said. And there was a flicker of something in her voice, not quite hope, not quite denial, but something in between. He is talking to the coordinator, to the manager. He thinks it is just a misunderstanding. I allowed myself a brief glance at the phone on my desk, at the confirmation message that had already outlined the process in motion. Then I looked back out at the city. It is not a misunderstanding, I said, my voice steady. It is a violation. The words settled heavily between us and this time. She did not try to reframe it. She did not argue immediately, because something in the situation had already begun to confirm it for her. They are asking for us to provide documentation now, she said. And there was a clear shift in her tone, more direct, more exposed. They want proof of authorization. I nodded slightly, even though she could not see it. And can you provide it? I asked, and the question hung there, simple, precise, unavoidable. There was no answer at first. Just the sound of her breathing, steady but tight. And then, finally, she spoke. No, she said, quietly. And that single word carried more weight than everything she had said before, because it was the first time she had stepped out of assumption and into fact. I let a brief silence follow. Not to emphasize it, but to allow it to exist fully. Then I spoke again, my tone unchanged. Then there is nothing to resolve, I said. And on her end, I could hear the shift in the environment reach its next stage. The music completely gone now, replaced by the low hum of conversation outside, the gathering of guests beyond the doors, the event no longer contained within the house, but spilling outward into uncertainty. And in that moment, I knew the illusion had fully broken, not loudly, not dramatically, but completely, and there was no way for it to return to what it had been, no matter what she said next. The word hung there between us, simple and final, and for a moment, Olivia did not respond, not because the line had dropped or because she had stepped away, but because there was nothing left to frame, nothing left to reinterpret, and I could hear it in the way the background noise had shifted again. No longer the hum of a gathering, but the low, unsettled murmur of people waiting outside, conversations overlapping in uncertain tones, the occasional question rising just enough to be noticed. Before being absorbed back into the crowd, they are all outside now, she said finally, her voice quieter, more contained, as if she had stepped into a space where the reality could not be ignored any longer. The entire event, she added. And there was something in the way she said it that carried weight, not just inconvenience, but consequence. I did not answer immediately. I let her continue, because this was the part where clarity expands on its own. Some of them are asking if this is a legal issue, she said, and I could almost picture it, the guests standing in small groups on the driveway and along the curb, checking their phones, exchanging looks, recalibrating their expectations of the evening. Jason is trying to reassure them, she added. But the certainty that had once supported that effort was no longer present in her voice. I leaned slightly forward, resting my hand on the desk, my fingers still, because movement was not necessary. What is he telling them? I asked, and there was a pause, not long, but enough to suggest hesitation. That it is a temporary misunderstanding, she said, repeating the phrase more slowly this time, as if hearing it aloud had changed how it sounded. I let a small silence follow. Then I spoke, my tone even. And do you believe that? The question was direct, without pressure, and that was what made it unavoidable. There was no immediate answer, just the faint sound of her breathing, steady but tight. And then she spoke, softer now. I do not know, she said, and that was the first honest statement she had made since the call began. I acknowledged it with a slight nod, even though she could not see it, because recognition matters in moments like this, not for comfort, but for alignment. Then listen to what they are telling you, I said, not raising my voice, not adding emphasis, just placing the next step where it belonged. There was movement again on her end, closer this time, as if someone had approached her directly, and I heard Jason's voice more clearly now, speaking quickly, asking her something, his tone no longer controlled, and she responded to him in a low voice I could not fully make out before returning to the line. They are asking us to sign something, she said, And there was a new layer in her voice now, uncertainty edged with urgency, a notice acknowledging the violation. I closed my eyes briefly, not out of emotion, but to mark the progression, because this was the point where the system moved from observation to documentation, where everything became formal, recorded, undeniable. Then read it carefully. I said, my voice steady. Every word matters. There was a small pause. Then she spoke again. It says the occupancy status is under review, she read slowly, as if seeing the words for the first time made them heavier. And that continued non-compliance may result in immediate suspension. I did not interrupt. I let her finish, because hearing it in her own voice was part of the process. Then I responded, calm, precise. That is correct. There was a sharp exhale on her end, followed by a brief silence. And when she spoke again, the shift was complete. Dad, she said, and this time there was no distance in the word, no performance, just recognition. What does that mean? I leaned back in my chair, my gaze moving once more to the city beyond the glass, the lights steady, unchanged. Because the answer did not require urgency, it required clarity. It means the terms that allowed you to live there are no longer guaranteed, I said, each word placed carefully. And until that review is resolved, your right to remain in the property can be restricted. The silence that followed was deeper than before, not empty, but filled with understanding that had finally reached the surface. And I could hear it in the way she did not respond immediately, in the way the noise behind her seemed to fade for a moment, as if the entire situation had narrowed to a single point. They are asking if we want to continue the event somewhere else, she said after a few seconds, her voice quieter now, more measured, or formally close it here. I let that question settle, then I answered, not as a suggestion, but as a statement of fact. That decision has already been made, I said, and on the other end of the line, I could feel the weight of that realization land, not as a shock, but as something inevitable, something that had been set in motion the moment the terms were ignored, and now, finally, fully visible to everyone involved. There was no immediate reply after I said that, just a long, steady silence that carried more weight than anything Olivia had said before, and I could hear the world around her continuing to move without her catching up to it. The distant murmur of guests now more dispersed, engines starting as some people chose to leave entirely, the low voices of staff coordinating what was left of an event that no longer existed. And somewhere closer, Jason speaking again, but not with authority this time. His tone edged with urgency, asking questions that were no longer being answered the way he expected. They want a decision right now, Olivia said finally, her voice quieter, no longer pushing back, no longer trying to frame the situation, just reporting it as it was. Either we formally close it here or relocate everything. I leaned slightly forward, resting my hands together on the desk, because this was the moment where action would follow realization, and action, once taken, has a way of locking things into place. And what are you going to choose? I asked, not to guide her, but to make the choice visible. There was a pause, and I could hear her breathing more clearly now, steady but controlled, as if she was holding herself in place while everything else shifted around her. We cannot relocate, she said after a few seconds, and the certainty in that statement was different from before, not based on assumption, but on limitation. The vendors are contracted to this location. The permits are tied to this address, and most of the guests are already leaving. I nodded slightly, because that was how systems worked. They interconnected, they reinforced each other, and when one part failed, the rest followed, not dramatically, but inevitably. Then you already have your answer, I said, my tone calm, unchanged, and there was another pause, shorter this time, more focused. If we close it, what happens next? She asked, and the question was direct, stripped of everything that had come before, and I could hear in it the shift from managing perception to understanding consequence. I looked out at the city again, the lights stretching in precise lines, each one part of a system that did not adjust for individual expectation. And then I answered. The review continues, I said. The documentation is finalized, and the trust administrators determine the next steps based on the violation. There was a faint sound of movement on her end, as if she had turned to look at something or someone, and then she spoke again. And that could mean what? I did not rush the answer, because clarity matters more than speed in moments like this. It could mean restrictions on access, I said. It could mean suspension of occupancy rights, temporarily or permanently, depending on the outcome. The silence that followed was heavier than before, not because the words were louder, but because they had finally reached a place where they could not be ignored. Jason is saying this is not possible, she said after a few seconds, and there was something almost distant in her tone now, as if she was repeating his words without fully attaching to them. He says we have lived there for years, that this cannot just change overnight. I let a small pause follow that. Then I spoke, not to argue, but to correct the frame. It did not change overnight, I said quietly. The terms have always been the same. I could hear Jason again in the background, louder now, more insistent, asking her to put him on the phone, to let him speak directly, and Olivia did not respond to him immediately, which told me something had shifted further than words could show. He wants to talk to you, she said finally, and there was no pressure in the statement, just an acknowledgement. I remained still, my posture unchanged, my voice steady. No, I said, simply, and I let that stand on its own. Because this was not a conversation that could be negotiated, not at this stage. This is not something that gets resolved through discussion, I added after a moment, and on the other end, I could feel the weight of that decision settle, not as resistance, but as understanding. Then we are going to close it, Olivia said, and this time there was no hesitation, no attempt to adjust the situation, just a statement of action. I acknowledged it with a slight nod, even though she could not see it. That is the correct step, I said, and for a brief moment, neither of us spoke again. But this silence was different from the others. It was not filled with uncertainty or resistance. It was filled with the quiet recognition that something fundamental had shifted and could not be shifted back. And as I sat there in the stillness of my office, listening to the distant unraveling of a night that had begun with certainty, I understood that this was no longer about the event, or even the house. It was about the moment when assumption met reality, and reality did not bend. The line stayed open between us, but the urgency that had filled it just minutes ago had settled into something quieter, heavier, and far more precise, and I could hear it clearly now. The structured unwinding of what had once been a controlled event, staff moving with deliberate efficiency, voices lowering as instructions were followed rather than debated, the distinct absence of music where there had once been rhythm, replaced now by the practical sounds of closure. They are making an announcement, Olivia said after a few seconds, her voice steady but subdued, and in the background, I could faintly hear a man speaking, likely the coordinator or property manager, addressing the remaining guests with practiced professionalism, explaining that the event was being concluded due to an unexpected compliance issue, thanking them for their understanding, offering apologies that carried no explanation, only formality, and I could almost see it. The guests standing in clusters near the driveway, some checking their watches, others exchanging quiet observations, recalculating the evening into something they would later describe as unusual rather than embarrassing. Because people like that rarely admit disruption, they reframe it. Most of them are already gone, Olivia continued, and there was no attempt to soften the statement. No attempt to reshape it into something temporary, just a fact, simple and complete. I remained still in my chair, my gaze resting on the reflection of the city lights in the glass, because this was not a moment that required reaction, it required acknowledgement. Good, I said quietly, not as approval, but as recognition of process, and there was a brief pause before she spoke again. They are asking us to sign the notice now, she said, her tone measured, as if she had already accepted that this was not optional. They want acknowledgement that the event has been terminated due to unauthorized use. I nodded slightly, even though she could not see it, because that was the next step, the formalization of what had already occurred, then sign it. I replied, my voice calm, and I let the simplicity of the instruction stand on its own, because there was nothing to negotiate, nothing to reinterpret, just a step to complete. There was a faint rustling sound on her end, the movement of paper, the subtle shift of someone preparing to commit something to record, and for a moment, neither of us spoke, but I could hear her breathing, steady, controlled, and then the quiet sound of a pen touching paper, a small, almost insignificant noise that carried the weight of finality, because once something is documented, It no longer exists as interpretation. It becomes record. It is done, she said after a few seconds. And her voice was different now, not broken, not emotional, but grounded in a way it had not been before. I acknowledged it with a slight nod. Then the review will proceed, I said, and there was no need to elaborate, because the process had already been outlined, and she knew what it meant. There was movement again in the background, but it was quieter now, more contained, the kind of sound that comes after an event has ended, not with celebration, but with completion, and she spoke again, more softly this time. They are asking when we will vacate. The question came without framing, without resistance, just a direct transmission of what had been asked, and I let a brief silence follow, not to delay, but to ensure that the answer would land exactly where it needed to. You are not being asked to vacate tonight, I said, my tone steady. But the property is now under review, and access may be restricted depending on the outcome. There was a pause, shorter this time, more focused. So we stay until they decide, she said, not as a question, but as a summary, and I confirmed it. Yes, I replied, and for a moment, the line was quiet again. But this silence was not uncertain. It was transitional, the kind that comes when one state ends and another begins. And then she spoke, and this time there was something new in her voice, not just understanding, but recognition. You built this, did not you? She said, and the question was simple, but it carried layers that had not been acknowledged before. I did not answer immediately, because the truth of it was not about admission. It was about awareness, and after a moment, I responded, my voice calm, unchanged. I structured it to last, I said, and I let that stand without embellishment, because anything more would have shifted it into explanation, and this was not the time for that. On the other end of the line, she did not respond right away, and I could almost feel the shift in her perspective, the reordering of assumptions that had once felt permanent. And as the last of the background noise faded into something distant and indistinct, I understood that what had begun as a public dismissal had ended as a private realization, not loud, not dramatic, but complete, and there was no part of it that could be undone. The line between us remained open, but neither of us spoke for several seconds. And for the first time since the call began, the silence did not feel like tension or resistance. It felt like something settling into place, something that had been unstable finally finding its position. And in the distance behind Olivia, the last remnants of the evening continued to dissolve. Car doors closing, engines starting, the faint echo of conversations fading as people left one by one, taking with them their assumptions, their impressions, their version of what they thought the night would be, and leaving behind only what was real. They are shutting down the lighting now, Olivia said quietly, and there was something almost observational in her tone, as if she was no longer trying to control the situation, only witnessing it. The staff is packing everything, she added, and I could hear it, the subtle sounds of breakdown. Equipment being moved, glassware collected. The methodical end of something that had been carefully assembled just hours before. I remained still in my chair, my hands resting calmly on the desk, because this part required nothing from me. The process was already complete in all the ways that mattered. Jason is still talking to them, she said after a moment, and there was a faint shift in her voice when she said his name, not criticism, not defense, just distance. He keeps asking if there is someone higher he can speak to. I let a small pause follow that. Then I replied, my tone even. There is, I said, and I did not elaborate further, because the implication was already clear, and she did not ask the question that would have followed earlier in the night. She did not challenge it. She simply absorbed it, and that told me more than anything else could have. They said the trust administrator will contact us in the morning, she continued. Her voice steady now, no longer searching for footing. They want to review everything formally. I nodded slightly, acknowledging the next step. That is standard, I said, and there was no need to explain it further, because by now, the structure was visible to her, not as an abstract idea, but as something active, something that responded regardless of intention. And until then, she asked, and the question was not uncertain, it was procedural, and I answered it the same way. Until then, you remain under conditional occupancy, I said. No. Additional use of the property beyond residential. There was a brief pause, then a quiet exhale on her end, not frustration, not relief, just acceptance. Understood, she said, and the word was simple, but it carried a finality that had not been present before, because it was no longer tied to belief, only to fact. And for a moment, neither of us spoke again, but this silence was different from all the others. It was no longer filled with shifting ground, it was steady, grounded in something that would not change. Dad, she said after a few seconds, and there was something in her voice now that had not been there earlier, something quieter, more direct. When did you set this up? I did not answer immediately, not because I was avoiding the question, but because the timing of the answer mattered, and I let the moment stretch just enough to remove any expectation from it. Then I replied, my voice calm, measured, before you moved in, I said, and I kept it simple, because the details were not the point, the existence of it was. There was a pause on her end, longer this time, and I could almost hear her connecting the timeline, reordering her understanding of what had always been in place. So this was always, she began, then stopped, not finishing the sentence, but it did not need to be finished. Yes, I said quietly, and I let that stand on its own, because anything more would have turned it into justification. And this was not about justification, it was about reality. Jason did not know, she said after a moment, and there was something reflective in her tone, not defensive, not accusatory, just stating a fact as she understood it now. He assumed the house was, she stopped again, and I did not complete the thought for her, because this part belonged to her. The recognition, the adjustment, the understanding that what had been treated as ownership was never that at all. And after a few seconds, she spoke again, her voice quieter, more grounded. We both assumed, she said, correcting herself without prompting, and I acknowledged it with a slight nod, even though she could not see it, because that distinction mattered. And as the last sounds of the event disappeared completely into the night, leaving only the stillness of a property returning to its original state, I understood that the process had moved beyond correction, beyond reaction, into something more permanent, not in terms of outcome, but in terms of awareness. And awareness, once established, does not reverse, it only continues forward, shaping what comes next. And for the first time since the evening began, there was nothing left to expose, only what remained to be decided. The quiet on the line did not break immediately, and I did not rush to fill it, because there was nothing left that required explanation, only what remained to be understood. And understanding does not respond to pressure, it settles in its own time. And on the other end, I could hear the absence more than anything else. No music, no voices layered over each other, no movement that suggested momentum, just the faint ambient sound of an empty property returning to stillness. Everyone is gone, Olivia said finally, and her voice carried a kind of clarity that had not been there before, not because the situation had improved, but because it had resolved into something undeniable. I remained still, my gaze fixed on the reflection of the city lights in the glass, because this was not a moment that required acknowledgement, it required recognition. And she continued, not hurried, not defensive, just stating what was now real. The staff finished packing, the coordinator left, and the manager said we will be contacted in the morning. I nodded slightly, even though she could not see it, because that was how these things concluded, not with confrontation, but with procedure. Then the next step will be formal, I said, my voice calm, unchanged, and there was a brief pause before she responded. Yes, she said, and there was no resistance in it, only acceptance. And for a moment, neither of us spoke again. But this silence was different from all the others. It was not filled with tension or uncertainty. It was complete. Jason is inside, she said after a few seconds, and there was something distant in her tone when she said it, as if she was observing rather than participating. He is trying to figure out what went wrong. I let that settle without comment, because the answer to that question had already been given, not in words, but in outcome. He thinks there must be a way to reverse it, she added. And I could hear the faintest trace of what might have been disbelief earlier, now replaced by something quieter, more grounded. I did not respond immediately, and after a moment, she spoke again, softer this time. Is there? The question was simple, direct, and I answered it the same way, without hesitation. No, I said, and I let the word stand on its own, because there are moments where clarity must remain unaltered, and this was one of them. There was no immediate reply, just a steady breath on her end. And then she spoke, not to argue, not to reframe, but to acknowledge. "I understand," she said, and the difference in those words was not in their meaning, but in their weight, because this time, they were not a response, they were a conclusion. I leaned back slightly in my chair, allowing the stillness of the office to settle around me, because there was nothing left to manage, nothing left to initiate. The process was already in motion, and what remained would follow its course without intervention. "We will wait for the call in the morning," she said after a few seconds, and I confirmed it. "That is what you should do," I replied, my voice even. And there was one final pause, not long, but deliberate, as if she was considering something beyond the situation itself. And then she spoke, quietly. "You did not raise your voice," she said, and the observation was unexpected, not because it was inaccurate, but because it had not been acknowledged before. I let a small silence follow, then I answered. "It was not necessary," I said, and I kept it simple, because anything more would have changed the meaning. And on the other end, she did not respond immediately, but I could feel the shift in how she received that, not as a defense, not as a statement, but as something to carry forward. "Good night, Dad," she said finally, and there was no distance in it. No performance, just the word as it was meant to be used. And I replied in the same tone, unchanged, "Good night, Olivia." And I ended the call, placing the phone back on the desk with the same steady motion I had used at the beginning of the evening. And as I sat there in the quiet of the office, looking out over a city that continued exactly as it had before, I understood that nothing had been taken from me that night, only revealed. And once something is revealed, it does not need to be defended, it only needs to stand.